These guns have no place in our communities and have no place anywhere in Canada.
Today, I announced my plan to secure childcare for Canadian families.
We also want to build more affordable homes.
Quebecers are not racist, and it's unfair to make that sweeping categorization.
We're bringing in a cap on oil sands, on oil and gas sector emissions that will steadily decrease until net zero.
If we started making sure that the super wealthy just paid their fair share, paid what they should be paying, we could invest in the solutions that people need.
Over 30 days, party leaders have been rolling out campaign promises, taking jabs at opponents and battling over everything from affordable housing to gun control. But there also have been some notable omissions from the talking points, little discussion on major issues making headlines recently like systemic racism, Islamophobia, and residential schools. Today, on the Sunday Conversation panel, what's been overlooked or given short shrift in this campaign? Joining me from Six Nations, research fellow at the Yellowhead Institute, Courtney Skye. In Toronto, artist and scholar Cyrus Marcus Ware. And in Calgary, freelance writer Jen Gerson. Thank you to all of you for joining us. And Courtney, let's start with you. Let's talk about some of the issues that may have been top of the headlines up until the election and then kind of dropped off the radar.
Well, I think one of the things that's been really top of mind for me is racism and anti-racism strategies that are proposed to be put forward by the federal government, whether it's addressing anti-Black racism, which saw a lot of organizing, or Islamophobia that is increasing in the number of attacks that have happened over the past number of years against mosques, and anti-Indigenous racism. Like, all of these types of racial violence are linked together. And it's really important, I think, that they be addressed, but it doesn't seem like any of the parties have been willing to put that front and center. And there's been a real critical lack of understanding about how the policies that they are putting together are actually compound some of the issues. So, for example, Jagmeet Singh, the NDP, have made a strong commitment to development and developing and building more housing, and that, to me, raises a really red flag, because there are many Indigenous communities that are anti-development, that see further development on their territories as unwanted. And while there's a strong commitment to reconciliation, it's unclear about how this commitment to new housing links towards, upholding Indigenous rights and self-determination over land.
Okay, a lot to unpack in terms of why some of these issues that have been top of mind, certainly in the headlines, and even anecdotally, a lot of us would agree amongst friends and family. But Cyrus, what do you think has been missed so far in this campaign?
Well, I would, echo the concern, with so many protests in the streets about systemic racism, why hasn't there been a strong platform addressing anti-Blackness and anti-Indigeneity? I think that we saw a lot of people pour into the streets and talk about policing. Why has there been no one on the campaign trail addressing policing and addressing issues of justice in this territory? We know that there's a problem with targeted policing, targeting particular communities, the number of deaths at the hands of the police, folks like Regis Krasinski-Paquette, Jermaine Carby, Chantel Moore, so many people, so many families affected by the violence that is policing. And I'm seeing so many people pouring into the streets for protests around, addressing this issue of policing in our state, and yet we're not seeing that on the campaign trail. And then I would also say, I've been spending a lot of time in the parks in my neighborhood trying to support some of the encampments. There are encampments spread across this country with people living in tents, living in parks because the shelters are overrun, and also because of COVID, they're unsafe conditions. People are living in parks from province to province to province to territory, and we're not seeing a dramatic commitment to addressing these encampments and to addressing the policing of these encampments. We just saw here, I'm in Toronto, we just saw that the police spent $2 million this summer, targeting 60 people living in tents in a park, so this is outrageous. We should see more of that being discussed on the campaign trail.
Okay, a long list so far. Jen, care to add to it? What do you think was missed in this campaign?
Sure. I would focus on the fact that we are undergoing a major transition in terms of the geopolitical world order. The Western Alliance is fundamentally shifting. I think our economic assumptions about the idea that most of us are going to get to live a middle-class life are shattering in front of our eyes. And bluntly, not all of the leaders have been focusing on increasingly petty, small little wedge issues, and fundamentally failing to deal with some of these just major global things that are going to have a real impact here in Canada, from the rise of China to the fact that we're no longer in a major Western alliance. We just got left out of that UK, US, and Australia alliance, to the fact that our economic recovery is by no means assured. And in fact, the more you're looking at some of these inflationary metrics, the more scary they start to look. The types of lives that we have been able to enjoy in this country for the last 50 to 70 years is fundamentally in peril right now. And we're talking about $10 a day daycare and, the Liberals' kind of fake gun ban. Like I've said in a column, this hasn't been an election. What we're engaging in right now is, parties throwing out these little perfectly polished, focus grouped talking points that are intended to split like 100 votes off here or there in key election ridings. There's been no understanding of the big picture issue, the big historic moment that we're actually in.
I do want to get the thoughts from the other two, because what Jen brings up is the fact that a number of the issues that Courtney and Cyrus are concerned about have an international component to them, whether it's Canada's a face in the world, whether it's Indigenous issues internationally, et cetera. So Courtney, can I get your thoughts on, as Jen points out, I think it's fair to say, almost a complete absence, other than some initial suggestions and criticism back and forth around Afghanistan, that international issues of almost any sort, even our relationship with the United States, have been virtually absent from this campaign. Courtney?
Well, I certainly agree with that. And I think it's really important to connect this also to how Canada's built its economy, right? Canada earned its place in the world by extracting resources and displacing Indigenous peoples. And as Indigenous people, and as people, as we continue to push back against that, raise awareness, shed light on the treatment of Indigenous peoples and Black people in this country throughout history, it really is putting a sharp focus onto how are we actually going to move forward with some of these policies issues and also uphold rights. How are we also going to end racism when the country is inherently based in this white supremacist construct? There's no party that's really willing to do these bold and transformational pieces. We're still arguing over, policy implementation that should have happened in the 70s and 80s around things like affordable daycare and things like that. So, and women's equality, we're really behind on implementing some of the things that we know will work and improve people's daily lives. And then we're faced with these monumental challenges like climate change. And it's just not seeming like there's anyone willing to do kind of like bold or innovative things that are necessary at this point in time.
Cyrus, what does it say to you that politicians have been, it seems, reluctant to even address these large, both domestic and international issues in this campaign?
I mean, I've seen more mudslinging than I've seen actual promises. I've seen people sort of campaigning against each other and ripping each other and each other's campaigns apart more than I've seen a beautifully articulated platform, to be quite frank. I think that one of the things that we need to recognize is that the politicians, I wish that they saw beyond one election at a time. We are in a long game, strong game right now with climate change, with economic justice issues, with issues around systemic racism, as has been mentioned. We have a limited amount of time to get this right. We don't have 2 or 3 or 4 more elections to solve climate change. We don't have it. We literally don't have the time. The planet is warming at this rate that is so alarming. If we don't do something, if politicians don't do something, and if the people don't rise up and do something, we are going to be in a situation where we're on a runaway train and we're not able to turn this around. So I wish that they could see that this is more than just one election at a time, that these issues are facing our country on a long term. And so issues of climate justice, issues of where people are going to sleep in this winter that's coming up, all of those parks are going to get really cold really fast. Where are folks going to sleep? So how are we building a long-term solution into these things? I wish that we weren't just going every 2 years or every 4 years at a time.
So, Jen, in terms of domestic issues, in terms of justice issues, in terms of climate issues, and in terms of geopolitics, they're in the headlines and they're urgent. Why have they managed to escape the attention of the politicians during this campaign, do you think?
Because many of these problems are too big to solve, and we don't actually have the talent at the political level to deal with them in any meaningful way. So, but I'll take two examples here. Is that one of them reconciliation? I think reconciliation is probably one of the most pressing issues of this election, and it barely got mentioned. We have a government that has sort of acknowledged that we're in the midst of an ongoing genocide, and yet the second the twit gets dropped, this basically just gets forgotten. The reason why reconciliation is so important is because that if we're going to start moving to a nation-to-nation relationship, that fundamentally raises existential questions about Canada as a nation, right? How do we maintain some kind of confederation, some kind of central government thing in a nation that increasingly sees the legitimacy of our nation state as suspect? I mean, I just don't see how that holds together. So it's a major existential question, and it's one that Canadians have to deal with. Climate change is another one of these too big to actually deal with problems. I mean, Canada accounts for 1.6% of climate emissions, so we have to get beyond these sorts of fights about whether or not the carbon tax should be $50 or $150 or whatever. Instead, start acknowledging that while it's important for us to have a climate change policy that reduces emissions, the fundamental threat that climate change poses to us is going to come in the form of, for example, refugee flows, disasters, economic upset, like fundamentally things that are going to damage our ability to live in this world in the way that we have become accustomed to. And instead, it's like, my carbon tax is better than your carbon savings plan. I mean, it's petty, childish, around the edges kind of debates that just fundamentally miss the big picture issue, because I just don't think the talent there is there to see the big picture issues.
Okay, some tough questions there for our would-be leaders. Let's invoke the lightning round just because we've got a minute or two left here, but I do want to go around once more and say, election tomorrow, there will be a new government, and this will be a government that, as you say, these issues are pressing. How do people get the ear and get the message and get them thinking, meaning their elected representatives, about these issues? Courtney.
Well, I think it's important to remember that regardless of, people who feel like they are, their votes matter in, some of these ridings where, there's a, debate around whether or not it's worthwhile voting. It's important to remember that voting isn't the only way that people can affect social change. People can organize, people can influence past this election cycle. And so I'm hoping when people see their issues not reflected in the debate, that they move forward and put pressure on their government, whoever's elected. Okay, Cyrus.
The most important thing that we could do is remember that tomorrow is just one day. Tomorrow is the beginning, not the end of this cycle. We need to actually, after the election, that's when we all need to get involved and put pressure on the government to follow through on their campaign promises. If the election goes in a way that's different than you expected, a different party gets elected, now's where the work comes in to actually push for the kinds of changes that you were pushing for during the election. And remember, the power of the people is incredible, and we have the streets. We can take to the streets and we can make our message heard.
Jen, how can people make their message heard?
I think those 2 points are just incredibly important. The idea that the democratic process doesn't begin and end on election day, that it is an ongoing process. It's an ongoing relationship between people and the government is an important thing. I think my fear is that Canadians are, as a people, extremely parochial. And we've been able to enjoy several decades here kind of disconnected from the movements of the broader geopolitical world and history, because we've been sort of sheltered by the Americans, both militarily and economically. And I think history is coming back. So I think that the electorate's going to have to reflect that.
Okay. Some concerning words and some wise words. Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate it. Courtney Skye, the Yellowhead Institute, artist and scholar Cyrus Marcus Ware, and freelance journalist Jen Gerson. Thanks for joining us on the Sunday Conversation.